Okay.
Yes, we told him to come on, Mia, at 7:05.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot. We tried to avoid having panelists come on before we actually started the meeting
Okay.
going forward. Okay, everyone, hey, good evening. Welcome to the meeting of the Mayor and Council of Princeton for June 30th, 2021. And we'll start with the notice of meeting statement.
Notice of this meeting was provided in accordance with the requirements of the Open Public Meetings Act and state regulations governing remote public meetings, including the time, date, and location of the meeting, and clear and concise instructions to the public for accessing the meeting and making comments. In addition, the agenda and all related materials were posted electronically and made available to the public on Princeton's meeting portal in advance of the meeting.
Thank you very much. Roll call.
Ms. Perrone-Lambros,
Here.
Ms. Niedergang,
Here.
Mr. Cohen,
Here.
Ms. Fraga is absent, Mr. Williamson,
Here.
Ms. Sachs,
Here.
Mayor Frida.
Here. Thank you. Do we have any announcements or reports that anyone needs to share before we get into our presentation? Okay, very good. So we'll have our presentation on the Franklin Avenue Development Task Force, and just ask people to try to remember to be concise and to the point so we don't have another extremely long meeting like we did Monday night. So who is, David, are you leading?
You're only asking for members of the public to be concise, right? Our presenters be long-winded if they want to.
Yeah, sure, David.
So I think our regular attorney for affordable housing matters, Kevin Van Heist, is not able to be with us tonight, but we have Frank Regan subbing, and he's going to give an introduction, and then I'll make a few comments, and Michelle, and we'll get started.
Very briefly.
Go ahead, Frank. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Frank Regan, Special Redevelopment Counsel for Princeton. As noted, I'm appearing this evening on behalf of Kevin Van Heist, Princeton's affordable housing attorney who has been involved in this matter for a number of years. The purpose of tonight's meeting is for the Franklin Avenue Mixed Income Housing Task Force, appointed last year by Council, to present its findings and recommendations regarding the project to Council. Council will require time to review and consider the report, so no action will be taken by Council this evening. Next steps for the process will not be discussed this evening. Thus, all questions and comments should be limited to the presentation of the report to Council by the task force. The Affordable Housing Committee, consisting of Council members Cohen, Perrone-Lambros, and Sachs, will review the report with its partners, Princeton Housing Authority and Community Investment Strategies. And when Council is ready to outline next steps in the process, it intends to do so at a Council meeting so that all interested parties will have the opportunity to ask questions and offer comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Frank. So I wanted to mention that when we were in the compliance hearing in Judge Jacobson's courtroom, and we broached the idea of having a task force to discuss this site, she expressed some degree of alarm. She said that Princeton was the only town in New Jersey where a dispute over a curb cut became so heated that it ended up in her courtroom in State Superior Court. She said that she remembered this neighborhood in particular, based on a whole variety of battles that ended up in her courtroom, being what she described as a particularly feisty neighborhood. And she reminded us that this site is part of our affordable housing obligation, our court-ordered obligation. And she was concerned that by opening up the process to an extended task force process could in some way delay or cause problems to our ability to fulfill our obligation. But we really wanted to do it, and I'm so glad we did. It's been our discussions have been long and lively, sometimes even more so than Princeton Council meetings. We have not agreed on things, not surprisingly. And I think, it was interesting because there were a mix of people who do this for a living professionally, either as planners or architects or developers. And then there were some of the others of us who were relatively new to the process of figuring out how to design a site. And I can say that I learned a tremendous amount of in how people who do this for a living go about starting to engage with the creative potential of a site. And so I want to encourage everyone tonight who is listening to the task force members to think of this as a menu. And tonight is the presentation of the menu. We are not deciding tonight which items from the menu we're going to choose. That will be a longer process. But tonight is about coming to terms with all of the possibilities that are on the menu. And ultimately, at a certain point, finances will decide which entrees we can order, and how many, and whether we want to go with the more expensive ones or and how much we actually can fit in. And, there are, well, you'll hear tonight, there are a whole variety of different directions that we can go in from a design perspective. And they all have a cost, and they all have value. Sustainability has a value. Parking, there are all sorts of considerations related to parking. So tonight was really about learning about all the options, not about deciding which options we will ultimately decide on. So Michelle, do you want to introduce the task force members?
Yeah, I'm very honored to do so, and it's a perfect segue. Thank you, Mia, for that introduction. I'm very pleased that we have gone through this process. I share that with my colleagues on council, that this has been a terrific process, and it's really in part, or mostly all in part, of the wonderful people that have volunteered their time and their expertise. There's really a fabulous amount of professional insight, and I'm very honored to present. I'd like to say who the chairs were. What we did was, there's a lot to do on this task force, so we split up into 3 subcommittees, and those 3 subcommittee chairs will be presenting their portions this evening. And that was Joel Schwartz, Heidi Fichtenbaum, and Carlos Rodriguez were the 3 that led their subcommittees. And then the other task force members included Erlene Beaumont, Dana Moorhead, Juan Polanco, and Elizabeth Bromley. We also had the involvement of Joe Weiss, who's on PHA, and Leighton Newland, who's also representing PHA, the Princeton Housing Authority, on the task force. So I'd also like to acknowledge Tony Nellison, who helped facilitate these meetings. Tony couldn't be here tonight. He sends his regards from his sailboat, but lucky him. But he did a great job of helping facilitate and move the process along. Erlene, did I just want to make sure I mentioned everyone. So there's Erlene Beaumont, Dana Moorhead, Juan Polanco, Elizabeth Bromley, and then the 3 chairs, Carlos Rodriguez, Joel Schwartz, and also Heidi Fichtenbaum. So
And did you mention Dana?
Dana Moorhead. Yeah, I have it right in front of me, but you know how it is. You just want to go back over and make sure I have acknowledged each and every one of you for the tremendous amount of work that you've done and the hours you've put into this. This is one of the wonderful things about Princeton. Maybe Judge Jacobson saw a different side of it, but from the standpoint of the amount of engagement and everything people put into it. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us on council and the mayor for all of your work and the community as well. So without further ado, I think we should turn it over to the various chairs to give their presentation. Thank you.
And I'll just say I'm going to be the keeper of the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. And the order in which the three subcommittee chairs are going to be presenting. First is Heidi Fichtenbaum, who chaired the Sustainability and Landscape Subcommittee. And then will be Joel Schwartz, who chaired the Streetscape and Infrastructure Subcommittee. And Carlos will be batting cleanup. He chaired the Site Plan Design Subcommittee. So I'm gonna hope that, is everyone seeing this in full screen mode now?
Yes, David, thank you.
Great. And this is just the cover sheet, which indicates the subcommittees and their composition. And Heidi, it's all yours.
Okay, I didn't know what this presentation looked like, but okay. So, you know, we met and talked about sustainability as a really high priority, not just for this project, but for really all projects that are being constructed in Princeton. And then, you know, drilled down to think about what are the things that are most critical specifically for this Franklin Ave project. I know everybody's reading the headlines about what's going on in Portland and Seattle these last few days. And of course, we are experiencing our own little heat wave, not maybe as extreme. So what we did was we developed sort of a tier 1, tier 2. And that allowed us to say, look, there are some things that are probably a little bit more important than others. Everything's important, but if we have to sort of give some priority, we have our tier 1 items. And in addition to talking about sustainability, this particular subcommittee also talked about landscaping goals. And the two are fairly intertwined, but there is certainly overlap with the other subcommittees, and you'll probably see that. So
Heidi, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the presentation is exactly what each subcommittee submitted in the form of their report. So I can advance the slides as you see the more.
All right.
Yeah.
So we talked about, first of all, energy efficiency, and we really feel that Passive House is the gold standard for getting the best energy efficient project. This energy efficiency really is cash flow positive on day 1. And we're starting to see that the financing is more advantageous for developers and towns when they go for a high level of efficiency in their projects. And so we really feel that the architects need to have experience with high energy efficiency buildings and provide us with energy modeling throughout the design process, perform solar studies so that we understand where window placement and shading should be and how to maximize photovoltaic placement. And establish sort of the zones on the site plan where you have shady areas and sunny areas so that that can be appropriately landscaped. And then also look at a life cycle cost study for these various energy efficiency measures so that we understand the bang for the buck. That really is what that's all about. And this little chart sort of gives you an idea of what's involved in getting Passive House certification, but that is a really high priority for this subcommittee. Okay, next. And this sort of is a little graphic that shows you what are these sort of 5 key components of a passive house, right? It's airtight construction, a high level of insulation, optimizing the solar orientation, high performance windows, and then balanced ventilation. So when you make this very tight box, then you have very little energy that has to be used. And we also think this is super important when it comes to environmental justice, because folks who have less income, there's a real cost burden for higher utilities. The percentage of their income that they have to pay for utilities is really much more significant than someone of higher income. So there's that component. And in addition, another sort of environmental justice piece to this approach is creating a really comfortable and clean, healthy environment. Because the ventilation is well filtered, what you end up with is an environment that is got much cleaner air inside. And because people at lower end of the income scale tend to live in housing that doesn't afford those kinds of features, you see higher levels of asthma in those groups. So it's about health, it's about, energy savings and cost savings, and really, addressing the Princeton's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which is 65% for buildings, the built environment. So it's an area that's really important. The next item that was also a high priority is electrification, which basically means instead of using gas for your heating, your water heating, your cooking, you're moving all toward electricity. And that's because we believe the grid is going to become cleaner, and it will be driven by renewables. And that will get us away from using fossil fuels. So that's why electrification is so important. Okay. And then sort of this whole idea of light and air. I talked a little bit about the solar study and so forth, but we're looking for large operable windows, really careful placement, thinking about the right kind of glazing and shading, so that it's really makes the apartments light and bright and inviting. And then the last sort of tier 1 sustainability element is stormwater, because that is something that we've seen a lot of in New Jersey, is heavy storms. And there does appear to be an increase in the overall precipitation, but even more importantly, the intensity of the storms when they happen are, really have grown tremendously. And so we're looking for stormwater management to be based on the pre-development runoff of the site. And clearly, New Jersey in general is moving towards a much greener approach to stormwater. And we would look for this project to do that as well. For tier 2, we really want to avoid any toxic materials, things that off gas. That's a very, it's listed as tier 2, but it's something that's very easy to do. It's really very low cost, as long as you're thinking about it when you're doing the design and specifying the project, the products. We have a demolition and construction waste recycling ordinance in Princeton. It requires 50%, but we'd like to see this project push towards 75 to 90%. We think that's completely doable, and it's also something that sort of pays for itself, because when you send things to a landfill, it's actually more expensive than if you work to recycle it. And so most contractors are really at this point working to recycle at the highest level that they can. And then finally, water conservation. Oh, not finally, sorry, water conservation. So we're looking to use WaterSense fixtures. So, you know, it takes energy to produce potable water, so we have to use it judiciously. That's also something that's become very common, and we don't feel that there will be any kind of a cost impact for that. And then plan for the ease of recycling and composting. This is something that has come up over and over again, where we're working to do, you know, we have recycling for single family homes, and we're working to get our compost program back. But we continue to build our multifamily buildings without any thought for how we are managing the various types of waste, which is landfill waste, recycling, and compost. And that's really important. That compost really adds to the development of methane. If we don't compost, those wastes really go to the landfill, and they really augment the output of methane from our landfills. And methane is, I don't know, 30 times more potent as a greenhouse gas. So we're really looking to start thinking more about how we manage waste, even in our multifamily projects. And then the roof configuration, you know, more flat roofs would allow for solar panels or roof gardens, which we feel could be a wonderful amenity on the project. You know, even you can have things that you grow, like gardening up there, or it can just be a garden space where you can just enjoy the view. So those were all the things that we thought about for sustainability. And then we moved to the landscaping goals, and I'm sure that Joel is actually going to go into a bit more detail, so I'm going to kind of gloss over this. But we thought that what we call the urbane streetscape, where we continue the typical pattern in Princeton of using street trees and activating the frontage of the project so that it's pedestrian friendly, you know, with porches and the sidewalks, allowing enough width, and, you know, really crosswalks, the whole thing, to make it more pedestrian friendly. Okay. This is actually one of the things that I felt was sort of unique to our group, which was a Figural outdoor spaces. And what does that really mean? I think the little sketch, although it's, you know, a bit crude, it really does communicate that the outdoor space is as important to design as the buildings themselves. And so by creating these various sort of sizes and orientations of outdoor spaces that are not left over, and there's lots of different ways of doing this. This is just like one idea, allows you to wander through the project and experience various outdoor spaces. So it's just important that the outdoor space not be considered leftover space. And we also saw that there were certain connections that the outdoor space could make with the existing fabric of the neighborhood. One was the idea of sort of a plaza type space at the corner of Franklin and Witherspoon, in order to you know, sort of receive or recognize the connection with Clay Street and the Witherspoon neighborhood. The others were alignments perhaps with other streets, the I can't even read what that says, but the little streets that are coming from the Avalon Bay development, and also Harris. Is it Harris? Yeah, Harris.
Yeah, Harris.
Right, Harris. And so that the way the outdoor space is designed recognizes the neighborhoods. And so there's a little bit of intersection between the neighborhoods, and it's we've talked about it as sort of the handshake. And then you can see the other piece of the landscaping that is I think is pretty important, although I don't know how feasible. And but if it's feasible, it would be a huge win for this project. And that would be to connect to the cemetery, which is a very kind of like large green open space. And to allow sort of pedestrian connection there would be really, really great. And then we talked about having sort of dedicated outdoor spaces for unique uses. So it's important not just to create sort of this figural space, but to actually understand programmatically what you would use the different spaces for. Just like inside a house, you would say, oh, this is the kitchen or the living room or the bedroom. You kind of want to do a similar thing with your outdoor spaces. And that would create spaces for individuals or the community to do, say, gatherings or gardening or what have you. We do feel that any outdoor sort of active recreation space should complement rather than replicate the playground over at Avalon. So we don't want to see another similar playground space as part of this project. And then, of course, there's Community Park that's right nearby. They have basketball courts. They also have a playground, tennis courts, you know, the swimming pool's over there. So we don't want to duplicate what is right in the neighborhood. We also feel that we can provide exterior spaces like balconies and decks and terraces as much as possible. And that will provide sort of variety in the architecture and provide these little sort of pockets of space for individuals to, you know, have access to the out of doors directly from their apartments. Okay. So, and then of course, we're looking at a project that did a great job with a green roof because we think that could be a tremendous amenity. We talked about that. We really want to minimize turf or just grass areas. We might need some of that, but we really want to move towards native plantings that will help with, you know, supporting the sort of diversity of insect and wildlife, and it will also help with managing stormwater. And then because the site has been built before and there'll be like lots of heavy equipment that will be part of building this, we want to make sure that we perform soil remediation. It's something that tends to fall off the edge with a lot of these projects, and you can't get really great healthy vegetation unless you have well draining and healthy soil. So we really want to deal with that. And then for our tier 1 or our tier 2, we want to explore the potential use of the cemetery. That really is only on tier 2 because we weren't sure whether an agreement could be made to have access. But if it can happen, then it would slide up to tier 1, I think, for all of us. Next. We want to reduce the heat island effect. So that's like minimizing a lot of hard surfaces, and where you do have hard surfaces, include shade trees so that they, you know, the sidewalks and the paving doesn't heat up so much. Provide the green infrastructure to enhance stormwater management as well. We want to have low maintenance plantings. So it should be something that native to this area that is well adapted, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to, get it to really thrive in the area. And so there's not, a lot of ongoing maintenance for it. The site lighting, where we can have full cutoff fixtures so that we don't have to, light the night sky. The dark sky is really important. And then finally, a tree buffer with the Jefferson Alley, providing treescape landscaping buffer along that western property line to create some visual privacy. And we feel that the trees really need to be of a significant size in order to, at maturity, like a 60-foot tall tree, once it grows up, to really do an adequate job. We don't feel like just a little row of shrubs will do it. So, and that's because some of the structures are likely to be fairly tall. So that was really the whole sustainability set of goals. And by and large, we feel that the vast majority of these can be done at, low or no cost, or in the case of the energy efficiency measures, they pay for themselves. So that's it.
Thanks, Heidi. Next up is Joel.
Thanks. First, I'd like to thank my two colleagues on the subcommittee, Arlene Beaumont and Joseph Weiss. It was a pleasure to work with both of them. Our subcommittee doesn't advocate specific design solutions. Rather, the work was to provide an analysis of the site and its surroundings, and to present examples of design strategies which have been successful in the design of streetscapes in Princeton and elsewhere, and which also addressed in a comprehensive way issues related to access and infrastructure, broadly construed. Two disclosures before I get into the details. One is, I personally believe that great places do not happen all by themselves. It takes a lot of effort and sweat by many people getting deeply into the weeds to do the work needed to produce quality design. In the absence of that effort, oftentimes what happens is that what is truly important gets overlooked. So in my remarks to come, if your eyes and ears glaze over a bit, please accept that and perhaps even embrace that as the price of good civic design. Second disclosure, in my more than 40 years of living in Princeton, I have often observed people here have a belief that since they find themselves living on third base, metaphorically, they assume they hit a triple. I believe that is a mistaken belief. The triple was not hit by any of us alive today. The triple was hit over time by the generations that preceded us. They did many, many good things. Some of their less good things, well, many of the less good things have been torn down and removed. But it's up to our generation today to do our share of the hard work needed to produce great places. There's a very important linkage among three things: understanding a site, having clearly articulated design goals, and then producing the result that is intended. The linkage among those three things is a design strategy. In the absence of that linkage and in the absence of that strategy, the process of designing and producing a project often becomes not much more than wishful thinking. So to begin, you see on the cover a site that's familiar to all of us. This photograph embodies the three things that this subcommittee was about. Access is a means of getting somewhere. The streetscape is the assembly of visual elements that form the character of a street. And infrastructure includes the physical facilities and installations which enable a community to function. First part of our work was to analyze the site and surrounding neighborhood. Even though we all live here, it was very helpful to take a step back and look at the area with fresh eyes. From Witherspoon Street to Princeton High School and from Wiggins to Valley Road, the predominant pattern of streets and blocks in the larger neighborhood is characterized by long rectangular blocks with short dimensions of approximately 300 to 350 feet and long dimensions of 600 to 700 feet. Nearly every one of those blocks is bisected by a 10-foot wide alley with public access. Some alleys are in active use and some are not, to the point of being overgrown with vegetation and are nearly impassable. Many of those alleys are just not visually readily apparent to all of us, even though we've all lived here for a long time. But either way, these alleys are delineated on the town tax maps and they're dedicated to public passage. This pattern of streets and blocks is especially consistent in the larger neighborhood, from Franklin to Goyot and from Witherspoon Street to Moore Street, with the exception of the site that we're talking about tonight and the location of the former Princeton Hospital, now the site of the Avalon Apartments. This settlement pattern is largely what makes this part of Princeton so walkable, a pattern of long, short blocks and mid-block passages. We all want this project to be sensitive to its context. So the next part of our work was to conduct a review of possible placemaking strategies in order to develop a context-appropriate streetscape. David, if you could go to the next slide, thank you. Can you rotate that?
Probably, well, hold on.
Thank you. Here you see a diagram that shows public and private infrastructure around the site. The red lines with arrows indicate lines of sight in and around the site. The infrastructure of adjoining public and private streets represent lines of movement and lines of sight. The eyes of a person in movement along these or any streets tends to focus on the view ahead. It would be a logical design strategy to take cognizance of the existing street framework as a visual design strategy, and therefore to make design decisions about the form and locations of buildings and spaces on the Franklin site with regard to their position as the terminus of a view ahead. The term designers often use for that is a terminating vista. You look ahead in the distance and something terminates your view. This is a person-centered urban design strategy, which creates memorable visual events by intentionally situating a design element on the axis of the view ahead. Harris Road and Albert Way are streets of relatively short length. However, they have a beginning and an end and lines of sight in both directions. A couple of examples of well-executed and even memorable terminal vistas in Princeton are Hodge Road. Even though Hodge Road is only 3 blocks long from State Road to its terminus at Elm Road, there is a thoughtfully situated and designed house at that intersection of Hodge and Elm that is exactly on the centerline axis of Hodge Road. And it bears witness that those who built it, designed it and built it, took careful cognizance of where they were building. Probably the penultimate example in Princeton of the terminating vista is the Princeton Battle Monument. It was intentionally positioned to be the terminating vista of Nassau Street. The visual axis is reinforced by a double row of flowering cherry trees, flanking a pedestrian path, and centered between another double row of trees, tall pin oaks, all on the same axis of view. It's worth keeping in mind that the Princeton Battle Monument was planned on no less than 6 or 8 sites over a period of 40 or 50 years before it was finally built. It was redesigned over and over again, and almost all of the previous conceptions for how and where it should be located and designed were not nearly as attractive as what was ultimately built. Meanwhile, back at the site. Clay Street, Pauline Drive, and Witherspoon Lane are all short, relatively minor roadways, but they have an importance to those who travel on them. Providing a visual terminus to a street in and around the Franklin site is a way for that project to say to people, your place in this town matters enough to influence the design of Franklin Village. It's a strategy which makes an intersection like the intersection of Clay Street and Witherspoon Street a place of greater importance and value. Conversely, ignoring the visual trajectory of a street is a way of communicating to people, your street and the people who live on it are not so important. Another design strategy is taking cognizance of the streetscape patterns which characterize the neighborhood. There are at least 3 distinct settlement patterns in the neighborhoods adjoining the Franklin site. One is the Witherspoon Street corridor. And though the site has only a modest amount of frontage on Witherspoon Street, there is still an opportunity for the design of this project to express an aspirational vision for lower Witherspoon Street. The second settlement pattern is along Franklin Avenue from Witherspoon to Jefferson Road. In that stretch of over 1,000 feet, there are no predominant settlement patterns which really command emulation. And the only existing buildings which will uses and buildings which will continue are the lightly used Avalon Park at the corner of Witherspoon, which many people do not find especially appealing. Second, the 3 Avalon townhouse buildings of 4 townhouses each, which many people do not find the frontage of and its relationship to the street to be especially appealing. There are 2 attractive older duplex homes at the corner of Harris Road, each with very short setbacks from Franklin Avenue, but they're very attractive homes. And lastly, there's 2 attractive older homes at the intersection of Franklin Avenue with Jefferson Road. And each of those 2 homes at the corner of Franklin and Jefferson have setbacks that most people would consider to be appropriate for that neighborhood. The third settlement pattern is pretty extensive. It characterizes the residential areas along Harrison, Jefferson, Henry, Moore, and the other neighborhood streets. And there are, when you, again, take a step back and look at that neighborhood, it's possible to extract a number of distinct, definable, articulatable, and even measurable settlement patterns. And there are 20 that we looked at. Some of them are obvious, and some of them are less obvious. Certainly the fact that they're all almost entirely 1- and 2-family homes is one. Another is that the relationship of the size and width of the landscape front yards relative to the heights of the homes, the number of trees, the location of the trees relative to the streets and the sidewalk. There's remarkable consistency in those patterns. And one way for this project to fit into the neighborhood is to take very careful cognizance and take design cues from those 20 or so patterns. Another design strategy that, a design strategy that incorporates as many of these patterns as possible into the design of the Franklin Avenue streetscape can, in effect, create a 1,000-foot-long visual handshake with the surrounding neighborhood that would be experienced day and night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year, in all seasons. An example of how this particular design strategy can be implemented is illustrated by the next 3 slides. Getting there. One more. Thank you. Could you rotate that, David? So this is meant as an illustration of a concept and of a strategy, not advocacy for a particular design. This shows a building located at the intersection of Franklin Avenue and Harris Road. And the idea here is assuming that it might be necessary to make the numbers work to have a building which is 4 stories tall. This represents a strategy for mitigating the presence of a 4-story building in this neighborhood. The strategy is that the 4-story building is the piece of building with a long corridor on the upper part of the drawing, which includes the little boxes numbered 1 through 18 and shows an amenity space in the back. In the front of that 4-story building are 4 boxes labeled as 6, 8, 11, and 13. In the elevation below, those 4 boxes are colored a darker color than the rest of the building. Next slide, please. The strategy is based on the following relationships. This is a cross section through Franklin Avenue looking towards Witherspoon Street. On the right, you see the existing Avalon townhouses. On the left, you see a 4-story building, but between the 4-story part of the building and the street are an extrusion of that building, or a piece of that building that's only 3 stories tall. And you can see from the arrows from the pedestrians on either side of the street that the 3-story elements completely block the view of the 4-story building, so that you effectively don't see the building except when you're in the spaces between those 3-story elements. Next slide, David. Here you see a little closer up view of that. Can you go back 2 slides, please, David? So in this concept, the 4 elements that are 3 stories tall are almost exactly the same size and mass of the homes on Jefferson and Moore. Between them are open spaces that are about the same size of those houses, and those open spaces are also about the same size as the yards on those houses. So what you basically have is a 4-story apartment building located far enough away from Franklin Avenue so that the 4 smaller 3-story building elements can be situated between the 4-story building mass and the street. The intention is to minimize the view from the street, the 4-story building. As I said, between the 4 house-sized elements, there are landscaped courtyards, similar in feel to the front yards of the surrounding neighborhood. Each courtyard is large enough to support the planting of enough trees to create a tree canopy distinct from the street trees. This second tree canopy could be composed of intermediate-sized trees, all of which would grow up to be taller than any parts of the buildings. Each of these house-sized elements has a front entrance porch close to the street, just like a typical house in this neighborhood. It has a walkway from the sidewalk leading to stairs, which leads up to a front porch with a roof, just like all the houses in the neighborhood. As can be seen on the colored drawing and on the cross-section drawings we saw before, the streetscape is therefore comprised primarily of single-family house-size elements separated by single-family house-sized front yards. In this concept, the parking is completely invisible, and the 4-story building is largely invisible from the street, screened from view as described. The overall streetscape is 1 story taller than the typical home in the surrounding neighborhood, the homes being primarily 2 stories, and therefore it represents a more modest change in vertical scale from 2-story homes to 3-story homes. Another design strategy is creating visually meaningful and usable outdoor spaces, similar in concept to what Heidi talked about. Another important design strategy is grounded in the idea of understanding the elements which comprise the setback of residential buildings. Surprisingly, though what I just said sounds pretty elemental and obvious, it's generally misunderstood in the development of multifamily buildings. In a neighborhood that's comprised primarily of 2-story homes, a 3-story home or building is not a 3-story home, or a 3-story building is not as strikingly different feeling as would be a 4-story building. But the degree to which a building is different feeling can be mitigated by the artful design of the setback. That brings us to this potentially confusing notion, setback. The word has multiple meanings, and it is often unclear what people mean by it in any given conversation. The word setback is sometimes perceived as a legal land use term, as in the distance from the front property line to the front of the allowable building envelope, and sometimes it's understood subjectively as all the space between the curb and the front of the building. I'd like to clarify what I mean by setback by spending a few minutes talking about its three constituent elements. There are really three visually distinct and functionally distinct zones that comprise what we usually refer to as a setback. First, beginning at the street, there ideally should be a planting strip between the curb and the sidewalk. Then there's a sidewalk. And then there's the part which is most generally misunderstood, which many people refer to as a dooryard, a term not in common use, but a very handy piece of terminology. The dooryard is the space between the sidewalk and the front of the residential building. Now, get a little bit deeper into the weeds. The planting strip, the area between the curb and the sidewalk, is the logical and preferred location for street trees. Amazingly, though that also seems pretty obvious, many streets in Princeton have no street trees planted in the planting strip between the curb and the sidewalk in front of those homes. Generally, most, but not all older streets in Princeton got this right. And in the older parts of town, you'll generally find street trees planted in a planting strip. However, lots of places it got missed. Great example is Jefferson Road and Moore Street. On Moore Street, the street trees are planted between the curb and the sidewalk in an appropriately generous planting strip that has supported the growth of a magnificent canopy of street trees. On Jefferson Road, there was virtually not a tree planted in the planting strip. The magnificent canopy of trees on Jefferson Road is a result of trees planted in the front yard. Why is this important? Well, those neighborhoods were built about 80 or 90 years ago. The tree canopy on Moore Street matured about 30 or 40 years before the canopy on Jefferson Road. When I say matured, I mean that the trees planted knit their branches together overhead to create the beautiful canopy that you see. When you drive down both streets today, they look the same, but they did not look the same in the two generations after they were first built. The sidewalk, the simplest piece of this, should be not less than 5 feet wide. The dooryard is the most complicated part. The dooryard mediates between the public realm of the sidewalk and the private realm of the adjoining housing. The goal of a successful dooryard design is to enhance the comfort of the public while they are on the sidewalk, walking down the sidewalk, down the street, in order to make passersby feel comfortable so that while they are enjoying the public space of the sidewalk, they are not intruding on the privacy of the adjoining residences. And it's also to maintain the comfort and privacy of the residents in the adjoining residences from the passersby on the sidewalk. To illustrate this, I'm going to show you a few examples of Princeton streetscapes, as well as some streetscapes in other places. Next slide, please, David. Thank you. I'm going to show you two streetscapes and we'll bounce back and forth between them. This one, as we all know, is Chambers Street. Next slide, David. David, if you could you make both images just a little bit smaller so we can see the, thank you, great. So this is the front of the Avalon townhouses facing on Franklin Avenue. Let's go back to Chambers if we can. Both of these streetscapes have approximately the same distance from the curb to the front of the building, about 20 feet. They are very different, however, even though they're the same dimension, they're very different in feeling and aesthetic. The differences between the two are very significant. It's not to say that one is better than the other. They are different responses to different streetscapes and different buildings and different scales in different locations. Franklin Avenue is quite different from Chambers, but in order to produce the result that I think we want, it's important to appreciate the nuances which lead these two streetscapes to be different from one another. So Here you see on Chambers Street, the three elements we were talking about. We have a planting strip, except on Chambers Street, for a variety of clever reasons, the planting strip is not continuous. It's been made into a series of planting wells for trees. Then we have a sidewalk, and then we have a dooryard. Because space was so limited on this street as well as on Franklin Avenue, the designers on Chambers used a variety of strategies to achieve a result that I think is useful in this location. There are a number of things that are happening in the dooryard that create a sense of layered privacy, which one does not see when you look, next slide, please, David, at this. When you look at these two streetscapes, there are a number of very significant differences. One is that in Chambers, there are street trees located in the planting strip that mediate between pedestrians on the sidewalk and the cars that are going by on the traveled way of the street. That makes the sidewalk feel like a more comfortable place for passersby and pedestrians. By comparison, the sidewalk on the slide we're looking at feels much more exposed to the roadway. On Chambers Street, we can go back to that. The stairs have been turned 90 degrees so that the direction of travel up the stairs is parallel to the building. That makes the stairs and the entrance stoop feel more private relative to the pedestrians on the sidewalk, even though the distance from the sidewalk to the stoop is almost exactly the same in both of them. It also accommodates another very important design element. In order to create privacy for these townhouses, the first floor has been elevated in this photograph higher than it is on Franklin Avenue. There's simply not enough room to put all the stairs that you need to get up to this higher platform if you didn't rotate the stairs. The trees in the Avalon dooryard are considerably smaller. They are not full-size trees, and they will not create almost any privacy between the sidewalk and the townhouses. In the design of the stoops and the stairs and the arrangement of the landscaping, the design at Chambers creates a greater sense of separation between individual townhouse entrances and the sidewalk, as well as between each individual townhouse entrance. There are a number of layers of planting and different design elements which separate the entrance to each one of these townhouses. If we go back to Avalon. This view doesn't show it, but we all know what it looks like when you walk along the sidewalk. The stairs lead directly out to the sidewalk, and there's almost nothing which separates one entrance from another. Layout of the sidewalks in the street tree planting at Chambers Street utilizes a very artful visual trick. If we can go back to Chambers again. Because Chambers has much more pedestrian traffic and therefore need for greater accommodation of pedestrians, but there's less room for a wide sidewalk. The sidewalks at Chambers Street have been made to feel like they are the dominant visual element in the horizontal ground plane. You see mostly sidewalk, and that kind of tricks you into feeling that you have more room to walk on the sidewalk. You do, in fact, have more room to walk where there's no tree, because the sidewalk is effectively 8 feet 4 inches wide, but it's only 4 feet 2 inches wide as you're passing by a tree. That clever arrangement allows this layout to have its cake and eat it too. It has more room for pedestrians, it has more room for trees, and everything seems to work together. In this design, a number of things are going on. Again, not to say that this is better, but that reveal the intention of the designer to achieve a variety of results. One I mentioned earlier, the first floor elevation of the townhouse is higher. That creates a greater sense of separation and privacy from the street. The facade materials are visually and consistently strong, which also tends to create a visual separation from the street. The ground floor has taller window and door openings. There's a nearly continuous flat vertical street plane that's 3.5 stories tall without any visual breaks. Some people may find that off-putting. Other people may find that appropriate for its urban location. But all of these add up to a result which makes the Chambers Street streetscape feel more visually separate and more private from the adjoining sidewalk. That's the appropriate solution, I would suggest, in this location. And that's why I've spent all this time describing what's going on in that location. That's one of the most urban locations in Princeton, and all these various design elements add up to a more appropriately urban solution. Now I'd like to show you a couple of streetscapes in another location that illustrate some of these important design considerations. Let's go on to the next slide, please, David. I'm going to show you several different streetscape conditions in a single 6-acre project in Metuchen. This was built about 20 years ago. It's also an inclusionary development. There are about 105 apartments. What's interesting about this project, and the reason I wanted to show it, is that I don't have a cursor. On the right-hand side, the street which runs from top to bottom is Route 27, the very same Route 27 which runs through Princeton. There are 20,000 cars a day on that street, just as there are in Nassau Street. So it's a very busy street. It has, like Nassau Street, at times 3 or 4 lanes of moving traffic. Until this project was built, there was very little traffic calming, and the cars were going by at 45 miles an hour, way in excess of the speed limit. Because of the demands of this project, there was a need to front individual homes almost exactly on top of Route 27. As you can see from the rest of the site plan, the world and the interior site is very different from the world that fronts on Route 27. And as a result, there are very different streetscape conditions. Next slide, please, David. If you could rotate that, please. And if we could shrink that just a bit. So here you see a detail of the site plan we were just looking at. And inside those 2 red boxes are 2 vastly different streetscape designs and streetscape conditions. They're vastly different because one, as I mentioned, is right on top of Route 27. And one is in the interior of the site where you have no clue that you're next to a very busy state highway. I say vastly different, as you'll see in a moment or two. The difference in the streetscape designs is such that one is 28 feet from the curb to the building, and the other is 20 feet. There's a difference of only 8 feet, but 8 feet artfully and thoughtfully applied creates a world of difference. Along Route 27, it's 28 feet from the curb to the building face, and on the interior, where it's labeled minor street frontage, it's 20 feet. We're going to get a little bit into the weeds on the differences between the 20-foot and the 28-foot street frontages. Next slide, please. So here you see the major street frontage along Route 27. In this design, because there wasn't enough room, and I have to say, on every site, there's never enough room. There's never enough land. There's never enough hours in the day. There's never enough money. So here, 28 feet is all this project could afford to accommodate this streetscape. So all of that is shoehorned into a 28-foot dimension. By comparison, the minor streetscape frontage fits inside a 20-foot dimension from curb to building face. The deeper dimension, the 28 feet, produces two very important streetscape results, which we'll see in a moment when we compare the two of them. On the major street frontage, the mowing strip is a little bit wider than is usual in order to create a greater buffer distance from pedestrians on the sidewalk and Route 27. And there's 15 feet, as you can see, from the sidewalk to the building face. That 15 feet represents a slight enlargement of the minor street frontage, and those extra few feet allow the planting of a second row of trees. As you can see, there's a row of trees between the sidewalk and the curb, and there's a row of trees exactly identical between the building and the sidewalk. The effect is very much like the alley in front of Firestone Library, which was the cover of our subcommittee report. And the presence of those two rows of trees and the other subtle things that are going on there is what allows the homes, which are only 28 feet from a very busy road, to be comfortable places to live, attractive places to live, and in the view of the marketplace, did not suffer any loss in value. People pay as much money to buy the homes on Route 27 as they pay to buy the homes in the interior. What's the magic in this design is the second row of trees. The second row of trees has the design element that I touched on earlier when I showed you a conceptual design for the front of a building on Franklin Avenue, in which there were 4 house-sized pieces and then 3 courtyards, the same size as the houses in between. When I described those courtyards, I said it was crucial for them to be designed to be large enough to accommodate the planting of full-size trees, so there could be a secondary tree canopy between the sidewalk and the building. Let's go to the next slide, please, David. Here you see one of the interior streets. At a glance, it looks exactly like the first slide, so what am I taking so long to describe? As you can see, there's a narrower mowing strip or planting strip between the sidewalk and the curb, big enough for a single tree, but the space between the sidewalk and the building is not large enough to accommodate a second row of trees. It's not needed in the quiet interior of the site, but it's crucial on Route 27. So in the design of this, though it seems unbelievably obvious at the time, it took an amazing amount of time to realize that a quantum difference could be accomplished by the addition of the extra 8 feet, which creates a streetscape which works on a busy highway, and 8 feet less makes a streetscape which works acceptably and perfectly, in fact, on a small, quiet street.
Joel, what do you mean by Route 27?
Route 27 is a state highway which runs north-south from south of Princeton way up into where it terminates in Rahway. So Route 27 in Metuchen, New Jersey, is also known as Middlesex Avenue, the way Route 27 in Princeton is known as Nassau Street.
Okay, so you're talking about, when you're saying Route 27, are you talking about Nassau Street?
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the street where you see the parked cars in this photo. That is State Route 27 in Metuchen, New Jersey. That road is about 30 or so miles long.
Okay, so but you haven't been referring, when you're saying Route 27, you haven't meant Nassau Street at all.
I apologize. I was not referring to Nassau Street. I should have said Middlesex Avenue and
Good,
Nassau Street.
okay, because Nassau Street is Nassau Street, not Route 27, just.
Right. It's actually, I don't want to get too far afield, but it's really important to take that into consideration because there are lots of things that happen on state roads and county roads that are distinct from what happened on town roads. But the reason actually I think is important to bear in mind that it's Route 27 is that gives you a sense of how enormous the design problem was to come up with a streetscape which looks as small town as what you're looking at right now. I'm sure you can't imagine that happening on what we call Nassau Street. There is no example on Nassau Street of anything that looks like this. And my point in this presentation is to illustrate that the feet and inches in the design of streetscapes is really crucial. It's not just the feet and inches, but parsing and parceling out all the elements that make for a successful streetscape. When the task force was broken up into 3 subcommittees, I don't remember whose idea it was to call this particular subcommittee Access, Streetscape, and Infrastructure, but it was a very wise choice because streetscape is really what people see that forms their impression of what the project is. And oftentimes a project can have twice as much density as it actually does, or 3 times as much, and you don't notice it because of the success of the design of the streetscape. So, moving right along. Based on what we've been talking about so far, there are a few takeaways that the analysis suggests. One is to pay attention to the dimension of the dooryard and what can be planted or not planted inside of it. So among the recommendations of the subcommittee are that the planting strip be not less than 5 feet, that the sidewalk be not less than 5 feet, and that the dooryard be not less than 20 feet for buildings greater than 2 stories. Among the things that I've mentioned so far is the issue of planting trees in the planting strip or in the dooryard. From the example that we looked at in Metuchen, not this one, but the previous one, you see trees that are planted in both locations. And that has an enormous impact on the livability and the perception and the feel for both residents and passersby than this, which only has street trees in the mowing strip. It makes a great deal of difference if a project is designed to accommodate the appropriate dimensions and the appropriate planting in both a dooryard and the mowing strip. The reason it's among the reasons that it's important to get the tree planting right is that, as I touched on earlier, when you plant street trees in a planting strip of residential street that has, say, a 34-foot cartway, which is probably what the cartway width will be on Franklin Avenue when all is said and done, the trees on opposite side of the street are 40 feet apart. A tree's lateral branches, after about 20 years, will stretch about 20 or so feet from the trunk. So that means around 25 years after the trees are planted, the canopy effect is beginning to be created where the tips of the branches start to knit together and you get the street canopy that's really beautiful. But when the street trees are planted in the dooryard, not in the mowing strip, so the difference between Moore Street and Jefferson, the difference is that the trees on Jefferson are about 70 feet apart. In that configuration, it takes 30 or 40 or 50 years until the lateral spread of the branches is such they start to knit together. So you could say, why do we care about this? You know, look at Jefferson and Moore, they're both beautiful streets. But think about what it was like only 20 years after they were built. There's another consideration. Today, many native trees that are well adapted for growing in our part of the world, are struggling with blight, which is probably related to climate change. Our street trees are much more susceptible to disease and premature death than they were in generations past. If it takes 20 or more years for the interlaced canopy to form and several trees die, it's very unfortunate. Hopefully the dead trees are quickly replaced and nurtured, and hopefully in 20 more years, the missing parts of the canopy are restored. But if the trees are planted further apart, then that restoration takes 40 or 50 years. That's a reality. We see it on Nassau Street. We see it, all of the Zelkovas that were planted had issues. And as a result, when we walk down Nassau Street on a day like today, you have no shade. So these things actually do have consequences in the daily experience of people's lives. To summarize the part of this that has to do with trees, I want to emphasize something that we believe is very important. And that is that there is no single improvement which can have a greater positive effect on the visual quality of a streetscape than the wise and proper design of the street tree plantings. No single element has more impact, and there is no element that costs as little, which has so vast an impact. It is the single most cost-effective thing to get done right. But like all things in life, getting things done right really requires a substantial commitment. And therefore, I'm actually going to read a short list of important recommendations in this regard. At the risk of restating the obvious, the primary street trees should be planted in the planting strip. The primary street trees should be planted at fairly close intervals, not more than 40 feet apart, and preferably closer to 30 feet apart. The planting strip should be wide enough to support the long-term health of the trees. At initial planting, larger rather than smaller trees should be planted, not less than 3-inch caliper, preferably 4-inch caliper on the street trees, because that's what you experienced from day one. If in the design of the streetscape, for whatever good reason, there is, for example, that one building might be a little taller than another building, if the streetscape design calls for an additional tree canopy in the dooryard, as was done along Middlesex Avenue, AKA Route 27 in Metuchen, then it's crucial to make the dooryard large enough to support the additional room that the trees need to create that secondary canopy and to ensure their long-term health. 6, this is the 6th criteria. It's crucial to make every effort necessary to coordinate the location of all utilities with the long-term goals for the street and the shade trees. That may seem unbelievably obvious, but it's not. It requires a great deal of careful ongoing vigilance from the very beginning of the design process, throughout the entirety of the construction process, and throughout the useful life of the project and its trees. There are 1,000 ways in which people lose sight of this. And then since the trees are planted at the end and the underground stuff happens earlier on, what almost always happens is, unless there is a very high level of vigilance, when the time comes to plant the trees, people discover, oops, there isn't enough room to implement the tree plantings the way we envisioned. Next, because there are overhead power lines and utility lines on Franklin Avenue, these should be relocated to an underground location. This will only occur if there is a strong intention and a substantial financial commitment to doing this. This is something that is in the long-term future of this town. It can't be done overnight. This project provides an opportunity to do this because there is not that much stuff on those overhead lines. And the benefit is that we have a large project with a large amount of frontage, and we can actually get this right. Everyone involved in this process will tell us that it costs too much, it's not the way things are done. But if the town, the developer, and the utility company partner on this, it can be done. It's been done in other places. The proof of this is that on Nassau Street in Princeton, there are no overhead power lines. In every small town in New Jersey, I put Princeton in that category, there are several blocks in the heart of those towns where there are no overhead wires. That's because several generations ago, in virtually every one of those towns, a commitment was made to say, you know what, in this place, we're not going to have overhead power lines. We're going to have beautiful streetscapes, and we're going to have beautiful street trees. And that was done in almost every town in New Jersey. The time has come to show how it can be done on this street. Lastly, this project must provide a mechanism that will ensure for the life of the project, the care and maintenance of the major landscape materials which comprise the living part of the streetscape. This can be done by bonding, by means of a developer agreement, which defines mutual obligations by both the town and developer, or by means of covenants which run with the land, or all of the above. It's important to think through this at the very beginning of the project. not quite done. I appreciate your patience. I'm going to summarize some of what I plan to talk about because I know I've been talking for some time. An important part of the infrastructure that the subcommittee focused on is social infrastructure, which oftentimes gets short shrift because we tend to think of infrastructure as being pipes and underground utilities. But there's a thing called social infrastructure, which includes spaces both indoors and outdoors where residents meet casually and purposefully, individually and in small groups. It's hugely important, as Heidi mentioned in her presentation, to think about those spaces early on, think about the size and the shape and the proportions of those spaces in order to make this a true community. Social infrastructure is also expressed visually on the building exterior in the form of visible balconies and terraces for individual dwelling units. Those speak to the larger community of the life of the residents who live there. They also provide private spaces where residents can sit, grow plants, eat and talk, enjoy fresh air. Balconies which project from the face of a building, which is often done, end up being surrounded only by railing and air. They are less private and less social and attractive than balconies which are inset into the face of the building. The latter costs a little bit more, but results in outdoor spaces which are much more private and much more useful and much more desirable. Lastly, with regard to social infrastructure, it's often expressed by more rather than fewer visually prominent individual front entrances, porches, and stoops. In the design strategy I showed earlier, we use that as an example to show how important it is to have more entrances, more walkways, more stoops to pick up on the visual imagery of the surrounding single-family neighborhoods so this project fits better into the larger community. Those doorways and entrances are literal and symbolic expressions of comings and goings, and they're meeting places for conversations with friends and neighbors. All the neighborhoods we love in Princeton have those features. It's possible to include them in a multifamily community as well. The mixed income nature of Franklin Village is also an important expression of social infrastructure and our aspirations for us as a larger community. It should be ensured in perpetuity that the 50-50 approximate mix of affordable and market dwellings will be maintained, and further, that the residents of all the various income groups be scattered and intermixed thoroughly within the buildings. In a similar way, the needs in terms of health, safety, and accessibility of the elderly and the young, as well as the handicapped, should be provided for in perpetuity by the original design and construction, as well as long-term operations and maintenance. There's just a couple other issues I want to touch on, and then I will let the show continue. The next point doesn't really need a slide. It's something that's less obvious. Actually, David, could we back up to one of the first slides, the one that showed the overall site? Thank you. If we could, you could leave in this orientation. I wanted to talk for a minute about the Witherspoon Lane condominiums. They are not the most visually prominent feature of a larger neighborhood. It's in the lower right-hand side of the screen. They're immediately adjacent to the Franklin site. Can you move your cursor around them, David? Thank you. The design of Franklin Village, we think, should take cognizance of that community, and especially its quiet and peaceful backyard, which adjoins the narrowest part of the Franklin site. And that's the area of the Franklin site where it's most challenging to situate a building of appropriate dimensions while still maintaining building setbacks. Vehicular access to the Witherspoon Lane condominiums is only by means of Witherspoon Lane, a very narrow public street that begins with its intersection at Witherspoon Street and becomes a private road at the condominium tract boundary. Witherspoon Lane and the 9 condominium units there were built a very long time ago. They've been reskinned several times, but they're well over 100 years old. The entrance to the condominium parking lot is adjacent to the common property line with the cemetery. It's also the location of the cemetery's stockpile of soil. By coincidence, this is also the adjacent to the optimal location for a pedestrian path, if there ever will be one, and many of us hope there will be one, which would provide a connection from Franklin Avenue to the cemetery, because the cemetery's internal paved road is almost immediately adjacent to this area. There's virtually no other place that provides the opportunity to have a pedestrian connection with the cemetery. It's a complicated issue that we don't have time to talk about tonight. It involves the cemetery's very reasonable, legitimate concerns about privacy and security and peace and serenity, but it provides a tremendous opportunity. It also provides the occasion for dealing with an issue at the Witherspoon Lane condominiums. In this location, the three separate properties, the condominium, the Witherspoon Lane condominium, the cemetery, and Franklin Village, all adjoin one another. It would, the issue that leads me to talk about this point, and it's the last thing that I will talk about, is because of the very narrowness of Witherspoon Lane, the fact that it's a cul-de-sac, and the fact that the dimensions of Witherspoon Lane are such that it's a very constrained place. If you've ever walked there or driven there and you've had to turn your car around, you may well have considered what might happen if an emergency services vehicle showed up there one night in February in inclement weather and had to turn around in a hurry when the parking lot was filled. It's fortunately, to my knowledge, we haven't had the sort of problem that could happen as a result of that. One issue that comes to mind is that could be dealt with to mitigate that is extending the parking lot to Franklin Avenue. There are many design strategies that can be implemented that can facilitate that through connection, while at the same time maintaining the privacy of the people who live there. This involves a lot of people. It involves the town. It involves the people who live there. It involves the cemetery. But this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to address a situation which really should be addressed. And if we, as a community, choose not to, we should only make that choice after we spend the time to thoroughly familiarize ourselves with what is at issue in this situation. That concludes the presentation of the subcommittee. I'd like to, with your grace, show one other thing that I'd like to offer for your consideration. I have a handful of slides which I think relate to what we have been talking about. About 97 years ago, you can leave right there, David, that's good. About 97 years ago, a private developer, 97, like in the early 1920s, a private developer designed and built on a very prominent location in the heart of Princeton, sounds familiar, doesn't it? A multifamily project with a much higher residential density than the existing homes in the adjoining neighborhood. The density of that project is 55 dwelling units per acre. It's a density greater than that of the Avalon Apartments. It's a density greater than the Franklin Village project, which are both Avalon and Franklin Village are about 50 dwelling units per acre. The project, which we're going to look at in a moment, is 55 units per acre. Next slide, please, David. You can see from if you can make out the date, this is the Princeton Herald from July 20th, 1928, announcing that the university had purchased this privately owned development of 39 apartments located at the corner of Prospect Avenue and Murray Place. Next slide, please. We all know what this looks like. We've all passed it collectively tens of thousands of times. The design of this community, by coincidence, maybe not by coincidence, dovetails with many of the design strategies that the committee has thought about. As you can see, it is a 3-story building immediately adjacent to a 2-story residence. the two buildings seem to get along as peacefully today as they probably did 100 years ago when it was first built. The building has been articulated into different pieces so that, next slide, please, David. When you see it from a distance, the courtyard is less apparent. It's less apparent that the building is made up of different pieces that encloses the courtyard. Next slide. From the air, it looks very different from the surrounding neighborhood. It's worth keeping in mind that this building with its 39 one-bedroom, two-bedroom, and studio apartments was built after most of the homes in the surrounding neighborhood were built. Aerial view, it seems quite different, but when you see it from the street, it probably does not stand out at you. I personally did not pay much attention to this building until just a few years ago, when it struck me that it was probably a fairly high density project. That's when I looked at the density and was amazed to discover that it's 55 units per acre. I think that it's worth looking at places like this because we like to think that our problems are unique and special, but in fact, 100 years ago, people faced exactly the same issue, and they came up with a solution that I think works so well that most of us do not give a second thought to this building because it fits very well in with its neighborhood. Its plantings were very well designed and conceived and maintained. And it shows that you can do something that's quite different, just as what we're proposing at Franklin from its surroundings, and yet it can fit in so well that no one gives it a second thought. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Joel.
David, you're muted.
Thank you.
Yep.
I took down the share because I believe Carlos has a version of his presentation that's got a little bit more illustrative information than the version that was in the agenda packet. So
less words for sure, and more images.
So I'm going to let Carlos share.
So what do I do here? Click the share screen thing?
Yep.
Do I open my file first and then click the share screen, or do it the other way
Yes,
around?
you should open the file first.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, oh, but now it's obscuring the share screen button. Okay.
Click on the Zoom screen next to it, and that'll come to the top and it'll put your file behind.
Are you seeing it? No, you're not seeing it.
No.
No.
So when you click share screen, you should get a range of choices of open files on your computer.
There we go. How about now?
Yes. We can see it along with all, there you go. Now you can see the whole thing.
With all the other files that you don't want to see, or that I don't want you to see.
No, all we can see is your PowerPoint.
My tax returns,
Yeah, we copied your bank account number down real quick, so you're okay.
Okay then. Well, good night, everybody. That was quite a learned disquisition by Joel. I'm hoping there's an opportunity to get some continuing education credits for the American Institute of Certified Planners. Anyway, this is the site plan subcommittee presentation. We had Elizabeth Bromley, Dana Moorhead, who's on the call, I believe, Leighton, who's also on the call, and myself. There's quite a bit of overlap to a certain extent between the recommendations of the various subcommittees. There are some common themes that you'll hear weaving through. The access to the cemetery is one of them. The streetscape treatments is another one. The public space at the corner of Witherspoon and Franklin is another. You know, I find that heartening that these three subcommittees with three very different people that didn't actually talk to each other all that much, came up with some common threads. So I always, I taught site planning for a long time at the university. And I always told my students that this was a sort of a three-prong exercise. You examine the site very carefully, the natural features, physical features, to the extent that you could, historical features, and so forth. And you got to know the ins and outs of the site itself. Then you looked at the immediate surroundings and the interface between the site and what's adjacent to it. But then you went beyond the immediate surroundings and you looked at the place that the site has in the bigger picture. What role does it play now? What role might it play in the future? What bigger forces, larger forces are at play that might influence how you design the site, or that might be influenced by the site, how the site is handled. And so in this slide, you see we're giving thought to the relationship between the site and the Witherspoon Street corridor and the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood immediately on the other side. We have the adjacency to the Presbyterian Cemetery, which we've already heard quite a bit about. We have what's directly across the street with Avalon Bay and Harris Road. And then we have Jefferson Road all the way at the other end. And I point out that this, I just remind everybody that this Presbyterian Cemetery is the largest open space next to the downtown. It's 17 acres and it is poorly utilized. It's an underutilized asset. And I think that part of the reason why it's underutilized is because it's hard to get into. It has multiple gates, but only really one gate is typically open, and it's the one that's the least convenient to the surrounding town. So, but on this slide, you see things are happening on the Witherspoon, in the Witherspoon corridor. The former Packet building is being redeveloped. There's an infill site, that former gas station directly across the street, which is begging to be redeveloped. We have a newish office building. We have a new cafe. There are plans to do all sorts of things. This corridor is changing. It's changing without a deliberate vision, but it's changing, it's improving. And while the site, the majority of the frontage of the Franklin site is on Franklin, there is a frontage on Witherspoon, and that is the hinge, and that is where this project can contribute to the continued reinvestment and revitalization of the Witherspoon corridor. So that is the handle there, and we'll talk more about that later. And here you see the plan of the cemetery, and you see this in this image at the top. That is where the cemetery abuts the Franklin site. The image in the middle is the driveway on the cemetery side that goes all the way up to the site, and that leads you to a gate that's 150 feet from the library on Wiggins, which is also generally closed. And then you see in the bottom photo, you see a view of the, you don't see the cemetery, but this is from Franklin, from the Franklin site. This is where, again, that fence separating the two. So this is the ideal point of approach from the site to the cemetery. And obviously, one of the, as you've heard already several times, one of the great opportunities here is to make that connection, that new connection, which would allow the residents, not just of this project, but of this entire neighborhood, to access the downtown and the library by going through an open space without having to deal with traffic. So now onto the site itself, the defining features of the site. It's very long. It's 959 feet of frontage on Franklin, but narrow at the Witherspoon side. Because of the presence of the cemetery, there's no opportunity to connect to a street network there. So the only opportunity to permeate is going to be a bicycle pedestrian connection if that comes to fruition. There are no defining natural features to help shape the design of what goes on here because it's mostly parking lot, except for the two buildings. And then the surroundings, which typically you want to respond to, the surrounding pattern is very eclectic. You have a wide diversity of land uses and floor plates. You have small commercial on Witherspoon. You have the large, very large Avalon floor plate directly across Franklin. And then you have single family and two families to the northeast and east. So it's a diverse land use context that needs to be responded to in a sensitive way. So here, this slide summarizes the design challenges from a site planning point of view, addressing the interface with the Witherspoon corridor, with the Witherspoon Lane and the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood at one end, addressing the interface with the Avalon project, which is not easy, addressing the interface with the cemetery, which is also going to be challenging, addressing the interface with Harris Road and Jefferson Street, which means a reduction in scale, and addressing the change in grade between the Franklin Avenue curb and the cemetery, which is plus or minus 10 feet. So the site rises from the Franklin Avenue curb to the cemetery. Now, possible responses and strategies. Create a corner plaza at the Witherspoon-Franklin intersection, lined by a commercial building with active ground floor uses. And we'll talk more about this later. Occupy the rest of the site with residential buildings with relatively modest footprints. Simulate a traditional block pattern by limiting building length to 150 to 200 feet with separations between the buildings of 35 to 40 feet. And these separations we call the muse, which is a very old term that was used extensively in Europe and in this country in the early part of the in the 19th and early part of the 20th century. And these are basically vehicle-free passageways that provide access to homes, but also provide through access. And so the idea there, and you'll see in a minute on a map, on a plan, you'll see how these would be put into place. And then as a general principle, scale down building heights as you move from the Witherspoon area to Jefferson and Harris. And then in terms of placemaking, this plaza at the corner of Witherspoon and Franklin, which we're informally calling the Handshake Plaza, with activating ground floor uses and movable street furniture. And then using a series of placemaking techniques that actually would name each building after a member of the community, would name each muse after a member of the community, would name benches, etc. And then public art, kid-oriented equipment at strategic locations, and traffic calming, and which traffic engineers now call pedestrian countermeasures, which planners have always called traffic calming. And that's critical because you have 1,000-foot-long block with no cross streets. And so the natural tendency is always going to be for cars to take off and go faster than they should. All right, so here is a conceptual okay. Here's a conceptual design for how this site might be occupied. On the left, where you see the building A is that commercial building, which I will talk about in a minute. There's the plaza, the proposed plaza. The other 4 buildings, B, C, D, and E, are residential buildings. If you look at the table at the top, you'll see 3 of them are 4 stories and 1 is 3 stories. One of the things that became clear to us as we looked at the site is that the 160 units of housing that had been earmarked for this site, that the site could actually, the holding capacity of this site at this scale is considerably larger than that. And so we have the flexibility of doing other things and going beyond the purely residential program. So without breaking a sweat, you have about 176 units in these 4 buildings, B, C, D, and E. And then you have a 5th building, that's building A, that doesn't need to be part of the residential program and can be something completely different. And then in between these buildings, you see these green tree-lined passageways. These are the mews, which would provide access to ground floor units on either side, which would provide access to the rear of the site. In this case, between building B and C, they would provide access to the new access to the cemetery. And then they would provide access to the rear of the site, where we envision a mix of community gardens, maybe some kid-oriented facilities, not duplicating what exists over on the Avalon, on the underutilized Avalon tot lot, but other types of kid-oriented installations, and any space that is not used by these functions should become an orchard and should be a source of fresh fruit for the residents. I'm told that peaches grow very quickly. And so you could have an orchard of peach trees back there. Now, for buildings B, C, D, and E, which are the purely residential buildings, these would be anywhere between 3 and 5 stories. They would have tenant amenities such as lounges with Wi-Fi, community rooms, bicycle parking, storage, etc. And again, every building would be named after a current or past resident of the neighborhood. And by that, I don't mean the famous people that normally get celebrated and that everybody knows, their names, I mean folks who have lived and worked and toiled anonymously for the benefit of the community, like the postal workers, etc., and who deserve to be celebrated. And the town could set up some kind of a process, some kind of a naming process to identify these people and celebrate their contributions. The architecture in these images is not meant to suggest any particular architectural style. It's just meant to suggest that there are many different ways that these buildings can be handled. And, you know, we're not making recommendations on any particular aesthetics. I'm personally, I tend to favor more contemporary expressions, but that's really not something that we expressed an opinion on. Now on to the muse. The actual definition of a muse is a narrow passage or confined outdoor space that is used to access dwelling units. And as I said, this was a device that was widely used throughout Europe and North America until relatively recently. I did find one example of a muse that's a new muse that is going up in Baltimore. But basically, these are passageways that are plus or minus 40 feet between the building sidewalls. They're treated as a linear park with street trees, benches, and landscaping. And they have pedestrian walkways in the middle, which are at least 12 feet wide and are built to also accommodate emergency service vehicles and possibly deliveries. So you would have a way of penetrating into the site with these types of vehicles without actually building a street, a proper street. As I mentioned in the back, any leftover spaces in the back should be turned into community gardens. Located between the buildings and the cemetery, they have a southern exposure. They are a tenant amenity. They are also an educational amenity. And if there isn't enough demand, then plant orchards. We see that space between the buildings in front and back also inhabited by a concerted effort to place public art and children's equipment, not duplicative of anything that already exists across the street or at Community Park, but other types of installations. Perhaps this is an opportunity for a partnership with the Arts Council or some other institution or multiple institutions, the Lewis Center. But kid-oriented equipment, such as a climbing wall that could combine physical activity, the arts, and intellectual stimulation, and also animate those outdoor spaces in interesting ways. And then the famous pedestrian countermeasures. These should be placed at strategic locations to slow vehicular traffic and enhance the pedestrian and bicycle experiences. At crosswalks, for sure. I don't know, we didn't really get into what specific type of traffic calming device might be most appropriate. Maybe there are speed tables at crosswalks. I don't know. That's something for the traffic engineers to discuss. And then finally, back to the intersection of Witherspoon and Franklin. This is what's become informally known as the Handshake Plaza. This is a new public plaza at the corner of Witherspoon and Franklin, which would be flanked by an L-shaped building with ground floor, activating ground floor uses. So cafes, restaurants, etc., uses that where people come and go and they're active. It would be programmed to function as a neighborhood hub, hosting multiple types of events such as food fairs, live music, dancing, etc. It would have movable furniture, public art, street trees and landscaping. It could be a place where these two neighborhoods could come together and organize all sorts of community events, interesting things. I see this as the middle public space in a string of 3 public spaces that starts at Heinz Plaza and terminates in front of Town Hall, which has a very nice public space that is never activated, but certainly could be with a little effort. And so this sequence of 3 public spaces would punctuate the experience on Witherspoon Street, and I think liven things up quite a bit. And then this famous building A, which is the L-shaped building at the corner, could be 3 stories, could be 4 stories. It doesn't have to be residential. It can be entirely non-residential.
Carlos,
Yes.
I just feel the need to interrupt at this point because I know you feel strongly about this building being something non-residential, but as we made clear in the task force, it is not possible for this to be non-residential and for us to get our tax credit financing. So, you know, as I said at the beginning, we tried to let all of the task force members be as creative as possible, but this is not actually possible. So I want the audience to understand that while this might be for some people very desirable, it's not actually possible. So it's not going to happen.
Well, I don't mean to be argumentative, but
so don't
the conclusion that it's
don't
not
be
possible.
argumentative. Go ahead and present what you want.
I was going to say,
but I don't want to raise anyone's hopes or unduly exacerbate anyone who might feel uncomfortable with this, because it unfortunately is not a possibility. We do have some constraints here, and one of them is our tax credit financing, which doesn't allow us to do this. I also just wanted to add and reiterate that there is nothing set in stone. Everything that you've seen here, from children's playgrounds to, you know, activated corners, these are all our task force members' ideas about what they individually would like to see happen. There's no formal decision-making process yet. Okay, go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you for that clarification.
No problem.
I can actually think of several ways in which the tax credit problem would go away, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. So the idea behind this building is that because the residential program is met elsewhere on the site, this building could become something completely different. And the idea is that it would be a hub for the neighborhood. It would provide for, as I mentioned earlier, ground floor activating commercial uses such as cafes, restaurants, perhaps a laundromat, etc. And then the upper floor is up for grabs. It could be makerspace for local businesses. It could be an industrial kitchen. It could be incubator space for businesses that are just getting started. Perhaps there's a demand for a second Tiber Labs. You could have child and adult learning in enrichment centers. You could have professional offices, art studios. The sky's the limit. We would have to figure out what the demands in the community are for this type of space and meet it. So it wouldn't be programmed from the beginning. It would be programmed in response to essentially popular demand. All right. And then in the miscellaneous category, there is the thought of widening Franklin Avenue the cartway by 3.5 feet to provide for street parking on the side of the street facing this project. The parking situation we viewed as being handled in a lot under these buildings, and possibly with overflow in the Avalon deck if necessary. You'd have bicycle parking for tenants indoors and for the visitors outdoors. As Joel mentioned, utilities should go underground, street trees of appropriate species, street lighting through wall-mounted fixtures or standalone street lights, horizontal and vertical articulation on building elevations, no blank walls, functional porches and stoops on ground floor units, something that Joel talked about for quite a bit, green building features as possible. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks, Carlos.
You're welcome. So
Share.
I should stop sharing my screen, right?
Yes, you should. Yeah,
Please.
Okay. I did that successfully.
well done.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to wrap up really quickly and say that as Carlos noted at the beginning of his presentation, there really was a lot of overlap between the recommendations of the various groups, and I think that is a good sign. You know, it wasn't a result of prior consultation between the members of the groups. It was just a consensus on good planning principles. Everything from the street trees, the front porches, providing both public and private outdoor space, putting utilities underground. I mean, there were a lot of points of agreement and relatively few points of disagreement, one of which was that the upper floors of the building A, as Carlos refers to it, could be something other than residential. And really, I will reiterate Mia's point, which was that the consensus of the task force was that that would not be a part of the recommendations of the task force. So I appreciate Carlos's doggedness in trying to sell his concept, but that ship has sailed. And that's really what I wanted to say, in addition to adding my thanks to all the members of the task force who volunteered their time. It was a pleasure working with you all, and I'm eager to hear from the public.
David, could I jump in real fast?
Sure, go ahead, Michael.
I want to thank, thank you, Mayor. I'm sorry, I came a little late. I want to thank everybody who put so much time and effort and creativity into the presentations tonight. I'm going to get right to my point because it's really one point in terms of design I want to talk about. I was pretty much in agreement with everything. More trees, double row of trees, bringing buildings right up to the street, having a strong street presence, all makes perfect sense to me. I want to get back to that, I guess what we were referring to as building A, or the corner. I think it was Carlos who called it the Handshake Plaza, and the idea of it being an L, but it forms a plaza at the corner. And David, you may recall this, and Mia as well, when we were at the planning board talking about the zoning for this site and how that could result in development. An idea that we were talking about was have a very strong corner presence there, a building right at the corner. In other words, flipping the L so that it defines the corner. And I think that does a lot of really exciting things that we should consider. First of all, corner buildings are landmarks. People use them to navigate through a streetscape, and Princeton has a great tradition of really interesting corner buildings, particularly up and down the Witherspoon corridor. There's also already an existing corner park right across the street that Avalon developed, and it could be activated better and used more. And I think it would benefit from being more physically defined by having a building at this corner. So I think we should think about that a lot. I like the idea of having uses at the street level, but I really think that we should look at activating the sidewalks and the street spaces instead of creating sort of adjacent open spaces, because then you have the problem and challenge of trying to activate all this extra space. let's keep the focus and the activity and the excitement right on the sidewalk and right on the street. And I really think that corner is an exciting opportunity to weave the neighborhoods together, but to give a real visual landmark as well. So that was my thought about that corner site.
Thank you, Michael. All right, so we're going to get to public comment. Generally, we keep comments to 3 minutes each, so just kind of think about what you want to say. And I'll just apologize ahead of time to anybody that if I have to jump in and kind of say you're running out of time, so don't get mad at me. But having said that, Adam, could we bring the first person from the public in?
Okay, we're starting off with Harold.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Harold Heft, and I live at 96 Jefferson, and I have some observations, and you'll see I have some objections. First of all, I will remind everybody we have a court-ordered obligation for 80 low-income units, not 160 mixed use. So that's an important thing that we need to remember. In my mind, the process so far has not been as open as it was promised to the community. No website was ever established. No interviews that I'm aware of were done with residents of the adjacent community. And apparently, no consideration of the important issues of concern to the adjacent neighborhood has been addressed, at least not what was presented today. For instance, there is no discussion of density and different development ideas, perhaps the 80 unit idea or less than 150 mixed use. No discussion of comparative costs of the different approaches that might be done. It's understandable given that 2 members of the task force have a significant conflict of interest that sort of biases them toward the 80-80 approach. There's no discussion of the negatives of widening Franklin and additional parking. There's no discussion of the negatives of additional commercial frontage. No discussion of modifying the height restrictions that were in the original proposal. No discussion of expanding the setbacks along the adjacent properties beyond what was originally proposed for sufficient buffers to the cemetery, Jefferson Alley, and other adjacent areas across the street. The draft calls for a 40-foot setback, for instance, on the Jefferson Alley. This is insufficient for a 65-foot building built on a higher elevation, which will loom over the properties that are on the Jefferson Alley there. I realize that the ones that are on Franklin Street may be 3 stories, but the ones behind them are going to be 4 stories and much taller. Per page 18 of the access write-up, it recommends that there's a 20-foot wide and in several of the drawings, single entry exit for the garage that would be parallel to the Jefferson Alley, buffered only by conifer trees. That in effect reduces the 40-foot setback to about 10 feet. Based on the drawings that we can see here. The report claims that this is no problem because the Jefferson Alley is a public right-of-way already with identical land usages. But please, Jefferson Alley right-of-way is for first responder access only, and it serves just 5 houses and 10 vehicles. It's not identical to a garage entry exit that serves 160 units. At best, characterizing the alleyway and the garage way as identical land use is a mistake, or at worst, it's a disingenuous smokescreen. This proposal for a line of trees buffering the alley along the garage calls for conifers that will at maturity be 60 feet, but what about before that? What will buffer the traffic noise, the headlights before then? Has there been any consideration, some other kind of buffer, perhaps like a fence? I wish that the same sensitivity that is apparently given to the Witherspoon Lane condos was given to the Jefferson Alley residents. Better yet, consider moving garage entry somewhere else. There's a misplaced emphasis on revitalizing the putative Witherspoon corridor. There's no justification for expanding commercial frontage right now in the current retail and business environment. Why is public access to the cemetery, to the real core of the downtown, of any interest? Those of us living west of the cemetery for years and years and years have had no problem walking an extra couple blocks to get to downtown. What is the non-aesthetic justification for additional plaza only 3 blocks from an already underutilized Heinz Plaza? And then finally, Why is there a drive to widen Franklin? The additional parking spots seem to me to run counter to the drive in both the bicycle and the parking proposals that are out there to reduce the usage of fossil fuels. In addition, there will be additional traffic along that area. It's already a main corridor for students walking to the high school and to the middle school from across Witherspoon. For years, the Jefferson Road folks have been begging for some kind of obstacles to help with that intersection there, plus to deal with the rush hour traffic that speeds along Jefferson Road to avoid 206. So that's what I have to say. I remind everybody, we have a court-ordered obligation for 80 units, not 160. Doesn't matter to me which we end up with, but let's fairly consider everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Okay.
Okay, next we have Joshua.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, Josh.
Okay, so it's Joshua Zinder. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I appreciate all the hard work that was put into this. It does feel like much of this had been previously discussed, that the presentation that was done, it was almost a year ago now, it feels like, with the Princeton Future Group, addressed many of these issues. I feel like the design and the process needs to be more innovative, I think, to address issues of the Jefferson community and of the current residents and of the Witherspoon Jackson community and the Witherspoon Jackson corridor. I think some of the issues that were addressed by multiple people back when Princeton Future presented it, we're beginning to think outside the box. And I guess for me, rather than get into a critique of anything we saw tonight, because I think a lot of hard work was put into this, my real question is, what's the next step and how does this move forward? And instead of us spending a few more years in panels, what's it going to take for us to actually get this built? And with 80 or 160 or whatever number it's going to be, our community needs these apartments, and I think that this is one of the most underutilized pieces of property in our town. And I know that there are a lot of hot buttons associated with this project. It just seems to me that more planning and more discussion isn't going to bring us there. We should start to advance it. So I'm really curious what the next steps are. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh.
Okay, next we have Marco.
Mayor, council people. I listened to this presentation, and I don't want to repeat the things that Harold said. I thought he was very good in terms of a number of points that he made. I just want to point out just a couple of things that I heard from the architects, from Joel, and that is about the line of sight. He mentions that on the other side of the street, you won't be able to see the buildings in the back, but I can tell you that the people that are adjacent and, close by, like myself, from our second story and our first story floors, we will be able to see much more. And, it's not fair to just say that just from the street that's important. The second thing is, I agree with what was mentioned, that I don't see why we're putting more cars on the street. I just don't see that as part of sustainable Princeton and what we're trying to do here as a city. I don't want our city to look like Cambridge. I know what Cambridge looks like. That's another college town, and there's wall-to-wall cars on every street. What you're doing on Witherspoon is not what you've done on most other streets in Princeton. and that is have two-way parking on either side. And I would prefer, actually, instead of having those parking spaces, to have a bike lane. It'll make things a little bit quieter, and I think it would be more useful for the city in the long term in terms of that. I know that the density, I'm not going to dwell on the density. I know that's not established what ultimately it will be, but it seems like it's going to 160 or beyond. And I would hope that there was some way of unloading some of these units to other sites that I've been talking to council people about. That I've talked to David about that. I've talked to Mia and other people in terms of the other types of sites like Dennett. And I think we should consider that instead of trying to shoehorn as much as we can into one site. It's not that I don't want the site. I'm happy to have new neighbors and that, but I just ask your consideration. That's it.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Michael.
I assume it's Michael Floyd. And I'm going to go by the written report. So on the sustainability landscaping section, there was mention of the passive structure, which I think is good. There were some problems years ago with it, condensation, it just being too tight, but it's improved a lot. Little concerned on the all electric appliances. Again, it's the hardware has come a long way, but it depends on a developer. As probably you all know, all electric, not too long ago, say 10 years ago, 8 years ago, was basically a no-no because it just put too much of a financial load on the tenant. It was actually a very inefficient way, dollar-wise, to heat. But I'm sure the sustainable people will keep an eye on that. The figurative outdoor space that Heidi put up, which is fine. It is just illustrative. Hopefully the building won't be shaped like that, although Carlos's building was just as sort of nondescript. Moving on to, and she talked about stormwater, and I'm sure you looking at how it works with the underground parking, if that goes forward, and where the water table is and things like that are just basic. But it came to mind when she mentioned it. I'm going to go to site planning, which was Carlos's section, even though he was the last speaker. My first question in that section or observation, it listed the building heights of 5 stories, 65 feet, 3 stories or 40 feet. I just want to point out that I'm not sure why it has to be 3 stories, 40 feet. All the zones around this area, whether it be R4, has a max 35, RB, which is on Witherspoon Street, has a max 35. B1, which is a township zone on Witherspoon, has a maximum 30. R9 has a maximum 30, which is the John Witherspoon Township area. And this site, which was formerly R4A, had a maximum 35. It just seems to me you're going for a little bit more than you need when it's already going to be a project that's going to sort of dwarf everything but Avalon Bay. So a little more sensitivity on that I would like to see. Point out a minor typo on page 17 of 57. It's talking about the corner and it says Witherspoon and Harris. And we all know you meant Witherspoon and Franklin. A personal observation or feeling of mine is you're going to need a service road somewhere running through the site. Basically, you're having apartment buildings. You're going to have basically trash problems. All your buildings, multi-story, especially with elevators. You're going to have a trash room. You're going to have trash chutes. You're going to have the garbage trucks get to individual buildings. And you have to look at, I believe, this site and prepare for a road that's going to run and access the buildings, however the buildings are laid out, which we don't know at this time. Parking, underground parking deck, I hope it comes to fruition. Obviously, that makes this project work. I know I would not like to see the alternative, which is put forth as parking underneath the buildings, but above ground. If you fill this site with buildings and on the first floor is parking, hardly anybody does that on a residential, and it's for a reason. And of course, you also talk in the report about possibly parking on, first it's mentioned for visitors on Franklin, if it's not needed for residents. That's in the report too. Now, parking was supposed to be covered on site. Now, obviously, if you do 120 units, you could probably figure some way out. But I know you're looking at within 120 feet also, or whatever, on off-site parking. I'm on the parking task force. Either parking's a problem or it's not a problem on-site. Let me see what my notes. Carlos also presented a little sketch regarding buildings, and he had A, B, C, D. I found it interesting that, E was 3 stories high down by Harris Road, but only one side of Harris Road. So far, I've seen a lack of sensitivity for the Harris Road, supposedly transitional aspect of this site, both in Carlos's presentation and in Joel's presentation. I thought it was relatively insensitive. Of course, the building before, which is also on Harris Road in Carlos's presentation, was 4 stories high. So somehow the 3 stories doesn't even apply to all of the Harris Road area. So it just seems Harris Road is losing out in some of the concepts that were presented today. Hopefully going forward, there will be a lot more sensitivity. I don't know what, moving to basically Joel's presentation. Joel's presentation, a good portion dealt with the Harris Road area. And he put up there a 308-foot length of building and tried to then explain to you that the bulk and height and mass and everything was going to be mitigated by the 3-story bump outs in the front. That doesn't change the fact that he was proposing a 4-story building, 308 foot long, when this report talks about trying to max out at 150 to 200 feet long. But Joel believes that this site can contain a whole lot more units. There was a great insensitivity to the supposed transition to the Harris Road area. Joel could have put up, and Joel, I do like you. Joel could have put up an illustrative alternative.
Michael.
Okay, wrapping up in 10 seconds. I'm there. He could have put up an alternative also, and this shows a real sensitive design for the Harris Road area. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay, next we have Martha.
Martha, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, I'm at 96 Jefferson Road. I live adjacent to the property where the development is going to be. My main concern is the height of the buildings. Even though you can say they're 3-story, they will tower over our properties along the Jefferson Alley line, because they may be 3 stories, but they're going to be raised up. I can't remember how many feet, I think 8 feet above the ground to start with. And they'll tower over our properties, which is not pleasant for us. And they'll be able to look into our buildings. The second concern I have is the driveway along the Jefferson alleyway, that to have two lanes of cars that can go in and out of the building is going to create quite a bit of traffic and quite a bit of headlights coming in and out that will be really distracting to our properties. And the noise will be quite loud with the cars going in and out all the time. Those are my 2 main concerns. Thank you very much for all your work.
Thank you, Martha.
Seeing no other hands, Mayor.
All right. Oh, one just went up.
Okay, 2 more. All right, we have Anita.
Hi, good morning, Mayor and Council and task members. Just a few things. I'm going to use the same word that a lot of people have used tonight, insensitive. I thought that a lot of the presentation was insensitive to the neighbors, particularly those on Harris Road and the Jefferson Road properties that back up to the lot. The heights is another concern for me as well. The height of the building should not be any higher than the adjacent homes. And Harris Road goes downhill. So if you are on Harris Road, you're going to be looking up at this. The further down Harris Road you get, you're going to see this as a kind of a monolith at the end of the road. I think it was Joel talked about, how these streets come to a T and they give you a view. Well, that's going to be a view of this monster building at the end of the road to Harris. And will also, as Martha just said, tower over us, making it possible, because we are so close to the street, for people to look right into our homes. So that is a major concern of mine. The parking was mentioned on Franklin, which I think also is unnecessary and unwanted, was on Franklin facing the project. I don't know what facing means. Does that mean directly in front, or does that mean under the windows of the houses that are so very close to the sidewalk already? So I would be asked for more sensitivity there. The density, of course, we've talked about before. It is 80 units that are required. It seems that more than that, the 160, it really does need to come down. We talked about this before, and I'm surprised that no one has addressed that. I would invite anyone from the task force who wants to see what it looks like from this side of the street. You're welcome to come by my home and take a look at it. We can sit and have a chat. These houses are very close, and we do have a lot of concerns. I think Harold put it best. Michael was very good as well. That's all.
Thank you, Anita.
Okay, next we have Virginia.
Hi, my name's Virginia Kerr, and I live at 124 Jefferson Road, and I'm going to try to keep within the 3 minutes. I'd like to begin with one point about the history of this neighborhood. It used to be a dairy farm, and it was developed in the early 1900s as the first addition to Princeton. It was known as the Harris addition to Princeton, after, I believe, a professor and engineer at the university. And the reason for the uniformity on Moore and Jefferson, and also eventually Harris and Carnahan, is because these properties were developed in accord with a common scheme or plan, so that the deeds had covenants, the good kind of covenants that set that specified the setbacks and the heights, and had such provision as no fences in the front yards. Also, this developed organically in the sense that people would buy lots, and some of the houses were built according to plans that were purchased from Sears Roebuck. So also, I believe it's simply not correct that these alleys are public ways. I think people who live, those of us who abut the alleys own to the center of the alleys, they're essentially private alleys. And I do think it's important to understand the history of the context and the specifics about the history and to get that right. I also just wanted to point out the very first low-income housing projects in New Jersey were built on Franklin, Maple Terrace, and then Franklin Terrace. Gerald Lambert developed those. He made his money on Listerine, advertising Listerine, and which got everybody to buy Listerine because he popularized the term halitosis, but that's kind of a side point. And on that note, I'm asking myself why the name Franklin Village for this development, since that connotes a sort of self-contained place that's not sort of tied to the place in which it exists. And it also seems, I don't know, it just doesn't seem quite right. And I think that ought to be rethought. I'm going to echo some of just say I agree that the density is a problem. The height is a problem. I walk along Franklin almost every day, and I know it's a parking lot, but there's a view. You can see the sunset in the evening. And this is an area that is underserved by open space. And ironically, parking lots, although they may seem unattractive to some, are open space in some communities. And that brings me to another point just about the plan for cars on Franklin. I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that children during the school year walk down this street every day, back and forth. So I agree that it's problematic to put more cars on the street. Whatever can be done to calm traffic ought to be done. And as far as recreational space is concerned, I know I think it was Heidi who mentioned that, that this is close to Community Park, and there's Mary Moss Playground, there's the playground across the street, but there really isn't enough playground space. I mean, we are a dense neighborhood, a dense area.
Virginia.
And okay, Mark, I'm going to end with a question.
Okay.
So two questions. I'd like to know what the next steps are. I think those of us who live in the neighborhood know what the final answer is going to be on the number of units. And I'm wondering if there's going to be any additional process for involving people who live here, and I've lived here for almost 30 years, in the process of deliberation. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia. Okay. Earlene, do you have your hand up?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right, I don't see any other hands up right now. Any council comments, questions at the moment? Eve.
I want to thank everybody who worked so hard on these designs and everybody on the task force. I really enjoyed reading it over today. I learned a lot from that and from the presentations. I appreciate all the comments from the public, from the neighbors as well. And I guess I echo what Josh and several other people have said, which is, what are the next steps? Because I'm not actually sure what they are. So that would be helpful in terms of framing any discussion we might have here tonight.
Yep. Dwayne.
Yeah, I
You
just
know,
wanted
I
to
am
mention
gonna
that. Oh, I thought I heard someone else talking just now. I just wanted to thank everyone who put in so much time and effort into this development. More so than just being a part of the mandate from Judge Jacobson. We do need more affordable housing in town, and I just want to see whatever the end result is. I know it's going to be something that we all should be happy and proud to have there. I've been listening to some of the comments from some of the some of the concerns, I should say. You know, so, some concerns I personally consider more legitimate than others. But I for one, as a member of council, I think I'm certainly going to consider everything that was said and whatever final decisions I make. But I do hope that whatever the end result is something that we all will find out will be in the best interests of affordable housing in our town.
Thanks, Dwayne. Any other council questions or comments? Okay, Frank,
Yes,
I'm sorry.
I think I would like to say something.
Okay, Arlene, go ahead.
Yes. I think I have to respond to some of the comments about just having the initial 80 group of just low cost residents. And I don't think it is what excited the people that were working on the task force. I think what excited them was the possibility that market people and people that are low cost would be living together. If you are limiting this to just the low cost, you're going to have a segregated area, which is going to be next to a high priced area, which is Avalon. And you're going to be it's going to be just like having the Maple and the Franklin now. Do you ever see the people outside? No, I've gone over there. I've knocked on doors and I've tried to make friends. And it's almost impossible because it's so segregated. And I think that is the thing that we were working to try to eliminate. And I don't care whether you have 80 or 120 or 160. Here at Avalon, we have 20%. And it works so well. And I think that was initially what I said. It works extremely well. That right next door to me, I have a single mother who's raising children and is of an entirely different economic group than I am, but we're friends. And I think that is what we are looking towards doing. And if you want to just have low-cost people segregated in an area, well, they will just be segregated, and we will be known as a community that just segregates people that are low cost. And I don't think we want to do that. And I think I just have to respond to this because nobody's responded to giving the other side of why we wanted to go in the direction that we wanted to go, and why in our planning we were trying to plan for how we could integrate people, have spaces where people talked, where people would have fun together, where people would have activities together that were of different, not racial, but were of different economic backgrounds. And I think that was somewhat our purpose, and I just wanted to give an answer to that. Thank you very much.
Well said, Arlene.
Okay, we'll get to, if there's more council comments. I also want to just get to Frank to help us talk about next steps and everything from an attorney's point of view. But Michelle, I think you had your hand up.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Arlene. You articulated so well what all of us felt on the task force, and I think on this council, and and a lot of people in the community have fed back to us, but you articulated it beautifully. And I just wanted to say that when we did the brainstorming before we broke into the subcommittees, I think it was Orlean, or it may have been Dan, someone had said early on that we want to find a way that this Franklin Village, or whatever we call it, would have a handshake to the neighborhood. We talked a lot about this handshake. And it was a kind of a concept, an ethereal concept, but then you've seen through the presentation tonight how that handshake took form and in various ways. And in Arlene, living right across the way, just thank you for articulating that. And I just wanted to mention about the handshake as being an underlying concept that I think really came to life. So thanks, but I'll let Frank talk about next steps.
All right, David has his hand up. So David.
Yeah, I mean, Frank can feel free to contradict me, but I actually want to try and step in there a little bit because Frank hasn't been involved with this particular site.
Thank you.
He may not really know too much about next steps. Frankly, the next steps are a little bit uncertain at this point. People may remember that council and the planning board actually undertook a study as to whether to designate this site as a site in need of redevelopment. That has not been completed yet. And the conclusion, whether it's designated or not, is going to change what the process is going forward. So we have to be pretty vague. I think the one thing that we can say is that we've told the task force and we've told the public from the start of this process that these recommendations would be passed on to the designers, to the architects and engineers who are hired by the developer to guide their design work. And it would be done in a different way depending on whether or not it's an area in need of redevelopment or not.
Eve.
David, that was, as you said, very vague. Do we have any kind of timeline?
Our regular attorney, Kevin Van Heijs, is not here tonight. And as Frank said at the beginning, maybe you missed the beginning, Kevin specifically said for a variety of reasons that we should avoid going into details, and that tonight about next steps and timeline, that this has to come back to the Affordable Housing Subcommittee. Tonight was really supposed to be about engaging with the substance, the design substance that the task force presented. As Frank, who echoed,
Then I withdraw my question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's
No,
just.
I did miss that. I was here for what Frank said, but that seems to have gone right by me. So.
But I think, yeah, I think we do owe at least something to say to the public that there is going to be opportunity for public comment, no matter how this goes forward, whether it be in front of the planning board, whether it be in front of the council. And it's likely to be at more than just one public meeting. It's probably going to be a number of public meetings. And I would hope that whatever comes out of this meeting as far as design concepts, design conceptual thoughts, would also take into account that there was public comment with concerns of some of those concepts. And hopefully those public comments would also be shared with any potential designers of the site. So I think that's kind of a reasonable assumption, I hope. And that would be an important message to the public this evening.
As I said at the beginning, this is just the opening start of a conversation and a dialogue. And I'm sure there will be many public meetings and many more discussions, but I think that because the redevelopment designation has not come before the planning board yet, and there are a number of other outstanding legal questions that remain to be discussed and resolved, we really wanted tonight to focus on the material that was presented by our task force, and they worked really hard, and to give them their due.
Yep.
One point I will make, Mayor, just based on a conversation I had with Kevin, is as per the settlement agreement, the Affordable Housing Settlement Agreement, the project does need to commence construction by February 2023. So there is just to give you sort of an outside date.
Right. So we need to, there's a calendar, right? Thank you, Frank, that goes backwards from there to allow for time for drawings, for bidding, for
Right, and
All
we
the-
have
all
to
the
be
agreements.
we have to be in the 2022 tax credit round as well. So that's a much earlier deadline where the site design has to have been moved forward by sort of May-ish, I think, maybe April, May of 2022.
Right.
But I think as you summarized, Mayor, I mean, regardless of the direction this goes, as David described, either redevelopment or zoning, there'll be, I think, many opportunities for both the council and the public to engage in dialogue.
Right. Thank you, Frank, for reinforcing that. Any other council questions or comments? All right, so I'm going to make an exception to our rule of people talking twice, just since Josh is an architect that is in front of our zoning board and planning board frequently. Josh, you want to jump in real quick and keep it very concise?
Yeah, sorry, I will keep it very, very concise. I think the deadline of 2023, recognizing that this project is going to have to go through DCA for its construction review and approval. I would strongly encourage everyone here to accelerate, whatever they're thinking for a process. You have to have community engagement with the architects. You have to select the architects. You do not have a lot of time if those are your deadlines. You are very, very tight. So I would strongly encourage you to move this process along. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Okay. Any other council comments or questions on this topic? I'm just preparing to move to the next item on the agenda, which would be public comments for items not on the agenda, but I want to make sure that there was nothing else on this before we moved on. All right, seeing nothing else from the council, I'd like to thank all the panelists that are not council or staff that joined us tonight. Thank you all for your presentations. Thanks for the public that hung in there and listened to everything, and thanks for your comments. So we're going to move on to public comments for items not on the agenda. Is there anyone from the public that has a comment for something that was not on tonight's agenda?
No hands raised, Mayor.
Okay. All right, seeing none, thanks, Adam. We'll close that section of the meeting, and not too bad for us, 9:47. If someone wants to make a motion to adjourn, that would be in order. Thank you, David. Is there a second? Thank you, Eve. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.